I'm Charlie Bright of Gold Derby, and I'm speaking with Adam Peters, who served as the composer of the score for Brian Fogle's new documentary, The Dissident, about the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi. The first question I want to ask is, in terms of putting this score together and getting it completed on time, were there any unique challenges for this project that you hadn't experienced before?
Yeah, yeah. Hi, Charlie. How are you? Yes, there were a lot. There was so many moving parts on this because whilst we were making the documentary, there was news happening every day. There was new things coming in all the time. We were working we were sort of really pulling it together in the second part of 2019. And, we didn't really, Brian didn't get hold of the murder transcript until about a week before I left to go up to Skywalker to help, with the mix and everything. There was all sorts of stuff coming in so late, and also with a documentary, you're always on your toes because you're not working to a script, so things are changing very fast in editorial sometimes, and sometimes the movie will be in a certain shape for a month or so, and then it'll just turn on its head as something else comes in, and you realize the importance that this bit of information shines on that bit of information over there. Working on this kind of project is actually really important to me anyway, for the way I work, is that when the project starts, I kind of shut the door for a month and I just write, and I write what I think is thematic material for what I've been talking about with Brian, the director. And the deeper I can go into everything in that period of time before all the real craziness happens, then the deeper well I have to sort of pull on things as the process starts to heat up. When we were trying to when we were getting it ready for Sundance, there was stuff going into the movie literally the night before we were doing the final playback. There's no such thing as a locked picture on a documentary. It's always a moving thing. But we were in the playback theatre up at Skywalker, and there was new picture coming in, which is impossible. You can't do it. So we still had to accommodate that. And then I'm still having to jump around and try and make things work thematically, because I'm like, well, that's her story, not his story. And that's come there and that's just happened there. So yeah, there's so many moving parts that towards the end, it gets crazy. And it's also it's kind of hard to, not hard, but you have to really keep your wits about you to keep this map of thematically how everything's working. Because this was this is a 2-hour piece, and there's a lot of themes and strands going through it. And, suddenly if something changes, 3/4 of the way through, it has to make sense. It can't just be a random piece of music that goes in there. So I forget what your original question was, but it's kind of mad the way it really starts to, the machine goes really fast at the end of editorial on a process like this. It's different from a movie where you've always had a script, and even though they'll be deviating from the script, but the characters are the characters and the storyline is the storyline, unless something's gone wrong in the shooting and then they're trying to put a new story together, or the ending's not working, so let's do this and let's try this. So Yeah, it was this one was particularly intense because of the way real life events were unfolding as we were making it, and news stories were breaking. And obviously Brian wants those stories in there, and that's what he does. He's a documentarian, and he wants those in there. So Mark, who's helping with the structure, Mark Monroe, who's writing, and I are kind of jumping around to really make this make sense.
No, that actually that answers exactly what that perfectly answers the question. Um,
Good.
uh, so one of the things I always find interesting with composers is that a lot of them will sometimes use specific instruments or lean on specific instruments to denote different atmospheres of the film. And I'm curious as to what were some of the key instruments that you leaned on to denote the different atmospheres of this film.
I always knew that I wanted to use a voice in the film, which is why the movie opens with a voice. I wanted there, even though it's a very dark story, and it's basically a thriller, I always wanted there to be this feeling of an absence of home. And I was thinking about, when really looking at these people's stories, all the characters, they're dislocated and they can't go home. And I felt that a voice was going to do that. So that's why I opened the movie with this Western crossed with Arabic singing. And it's a solitary voice. And so I wanted to use that. I think I also loved the way Morricone had done that in scores. I love the way he uses voices, solo voices. So there was that, and then I wanted to use some Arabic instruments, but I didn't want to be. There's a sort of. I didn't want this. I wanted the score to be a hybrid of Arabic and Western, and I don't also believe that music should sound like it's been picked up at the airport. Like if you're scoring an African scene, you don't just put African drums on it. I think that's I find that offensive, actually. And I also find it doesn't always really help give any other level of depth to the story. So I was using a Turkish oud type instrument, but I would actually use that in other places when we're actually not in Turkey. But I would start using that and deconstruct it into a more ambient, droney sound, just because I wanted to have this organic texture. And then I was using a lot of cello because I actually was trained as a cellist. So I knew that this score was going to be changing up until the last moment. And I knew that this is not the kind of score where you write the score and then you get all the parts together and then you go and record it with a ensemble or an orchestra, because by the time we'd be recording it, the whole movie would have changed. So I had to use instruments and sounds that are readily accessible every day to me. So I kind of decided to keep it nimble. So that and a bunch of old analog synths mixed with some electric cello.
So another question I have specifically about the score is, for scenes like actually specifically the ones you mentioned earlier where we see the transcripts of what happened in the Saudi consulate. Did you, a scene like that, if the score, is of it can be a bit overindulgent sometimes and
Mm.
can take away from, the of what you're reading and what you're witnessing. Did you find yourself taking any steps to try to make sure that it wasn't that the score didn't veer too much into that area?
Yeah, well, I think what you're talking about is a thing I have a natural aversion to anyway in music, which is melodrama. Um, and I think when I'm working on a project like this and other documentaries that I do as well, um, I think that the people that this documentary is about have done something and put themselves out there in the world in a very special and strong way. And I think that to sort of be melodramatic about anything to do with their story does them a disservice. And I feel it quite heavily. I feel an obligation as well as a desire to really represent these people, in the world. So I'm not gonna score those kind of things in this kind of way, because I think when people hear that kind of music, there's a time and a place for it and a certain type of movie for it that it's specifically right for, but it's not right for this. And I think as soon as something crosses a line and it becomes melodramatic and it becomes unbelievable, there's a certain dishonesty to it. And I am, it just, I recoil at that in these things. So these are horrific things that happened in this death scene. And I don't believe that making really horrific music helps that in any way. I think there has to be something, that has an emotion and tenderness behind it, as well as this sort of darkness that, is of course unescapable. So yeah, I very much pulled back, and I would sometimes would get notes like, "Hey, can you hit this harder?" And I will, I will turn around and say, "No, I don't think I can," or "I don't think I will," because I think this is the right level. And I think if there's this sort of subdued, simmering tension, that speaks, as opposed to constantly, really hitting people with these bangs and wallops and stuff like that. So actually the same in Hatice's story, who's was Jamal's love. I wanted to write them I wrote a love theme, but I had to make sure it was very, very gentle and subdued, even though I loved that. I mean, I would go, but I love Lawrence of Arabia and scores like that. I love Once Upon a Time in America. I love those kind of things. But their romance hadn't even fully blossomed. They were just about to get married, So I don't think I couldn't give them a fully realized love theme. It had to be sort of these fractured, beautiful chords with a sense of beauty, but it wasn't a finite, it wasn't love. It wasn't like you could do it in Love Story, but you couldn't do it. I couldn't do it in this. So, and I think that's really important, especially with making a documentary like this, that's made in this sort of powerful cinematic way. I think I have to be very, very aware of being truthful all the time in it. And if you cross that line, then you've crossed into another world. And then it's not a documentary, then it becomes something else.
So this is actually the second movie that you've scored for Brian Fogle.
Mm-hmm.
You did Icarus a couple years ago with him, and it seems like that's It's a pretty fruitful relationship, a working relationship. And I'm just curious, how did the working relationship between you two come about?
It came about initially because Brian Brian was sort of halfway through making Icarus, and he had loved what I'd done on Snowden, the Oliver Stone movie. And then he saw some parallels with Grigory's whistleblower story and the Russian thing with Snowden as as being these guys with this outsider status. So he called me, and I went down. I met with him. I met with Grigory. We watched the film, which was about 87 hours long at the time. And it was kind of, it was several films. We just got on very well. We click, and you have that with some directors that you work with. So we built, I built a position of trust with him, in that I realized that these guys that make these kind of documentaries are super busy, because they're having to travel, they're having to put these stories together, they're always going off. It's not like you go for a shoot, you shoot your movie, you're done, then you're in editorial, and then blah, blah, blah. So after I'd written my first few batches of music for Icarus, I think he and the editorial team realized that we were all on the same page and that I could be trusted, which leaves him free to go and do his job, because his job as a filmmaker is manifold on these things. I'll call him and he'll be like, oh yeah, I'm in Turkey, or I'm in Iceland, or I'm here, I'm there. And I'm like, oh, I thought you were just around, he lives just around the corner from me. So yeah, we've built a working relationship, and yeah, it's fruitful, and I respect what he does, and I think he respects what I do, because I kind of cover his ass. I just make sure everything's right. Even when it comes down to licensing tracks and things like that, I'll be like, yeah, I let's try this there, and let's do this, and let's just make sure we keep everything in the right place. So it's good. Yeah, we've just started Icarus 2. So yeah.
Well, Adam, thank you so much for joining us. We wish you all the best during this award season. And to all of our viewers, please like this video, smash that subscribe button, and don't forget to go to goldderby.com and use the Gold Derby app to make your predictions and see if you can outsmart the top prognosticators in Hollywood. Thanks so much, Adam.